The dusty wind carried whispers through the small border town as the sun began to set behind the hills. The day had been long, and the townspeople had gathered near the wooden platform where people were being sold. The crowd wasn't large, but the air felt heavy. Everyone waited for the next name to be called, their faces showing a mix of curiosity, judgment, and silent calculation. Among the tired faces, a young Apache woman named Ayanna stood quietly at the edge of the platform. Her hands were tied in front of her, not roughly, but enough to remind her she was not free. Her dark hair fell loosely around her face, dusty from the long journey. Her eyes, however, were steady. She didn't look down. She didn't cry. She simply stood as if the weight of the world had already tried to crush her, and she had decided not to bend. The auctioneer, a man in a large hat with a booming voice, shouted each name and number like it was part of a performance. People stepped forward, made their offers, and walked away with their purchases. The men were bought quickly. Some were strong and young, others skilled. The young women were chosen too, often by families who needed extra hands. One by one, the line grew shorter, but when it was Ayanna's turn, the energy in the crowd changed. The auctioneer cleared his throat and tried to speak with the same cheerful tone, but it didn't land the same way. "Next up," he announced, trying to sound confident, "a young woman, healthy, quiet, and strong." His voice echoed into the dry air. No one moved. Ayanna stood still, her face calm, but her heart beat fast inside her chest. She knew what it meant to be the last one. She had seen it happen before. Those left behind were usually forgotten, sent away, or worse, treated as if they had no value. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the price a little, hoping someone would step forward. A few men in the crowd glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Ayanna heard a few words float through the air. Words like too small, not useful, trouble. She wasn't surprised. She had heard worse before. Still, she stood tall. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to show fear. She didn't know what her future held, but she had made a promise to herself long ago. No matter where life took her, she would not lose her spirit. Minutes passed. The auctioneer grew restless. He lowered the price again. Ayanna stared out at the horizon where the sun painted the sky gold and orange. She thought of her people, the songs they used to sing, the sound of the river near her childhood home. It all felt far away now, like a dream she could never return to. Just as the auctioneer was about to end the sale, a quiet voice spoke from the back of the crowd. "I'll take her." The words were soft, but they carried through the silence like a wind through dry grass. Heads turned. A man stepped forward, tall with sun-worn skin and a wide-brimmed hat. His name was Thomas, a rancher who lived far from town. He wasn't loud, and he didn't dress like a rich man. He carried the calm of someone who spent most of his days under the open sky. The auctioneer seemed relieved. "Sold," he announced quickly, almost too eagerly. He named the low price. Thomas paid it without a second word, and that was it. The crowd murmured quietly. Some people laughed softly to themselves. Others just shook their heads. To them, it made no sense why a man like Thomas would buy someone no one else wanted. Thomas didn't look at the crowd. He didn't care what they thought. He walked up to the platform slowly. For a moment, he and Ayanna looked at each other. His face didn't carry pity, nor did it carry pride. It was a quiet look, steady and kind. He reached down and untied the rope around her wrists. Ayanna didn't speak. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. But she noticed something in his eyes, something different from the way the crowd had looked at her. There was no mockery, no fear, no greed. Just calm. As they walked away from the platform, the whispers behind them grew louder. Some people called out jokes. Others muttered that Thomas had wasted his money. But Thomas kept walking and Ayanna followed. She didn't know where this road would take her, but at least it was a road, not a cage. They reached his wagon, an old wooden cart pulled by a pair of sturdy horses. Thomas climbed onto the seat and gave her a small nod, the kind people use when they're saying, "You can choose to sit here if you want to." She climbed up slowly, her body tired but her mind alert. As the wagon rolled out of town, the crowd disappeared behind them. The sound of hooves on dry dirt filled the air. Ayanna stared at the fading buildings, the wooden signs swinging in the warm wind, and the last light of the sun stretching over the desert. She thought of her past. not as something broken, but as something she carried with her. She remembered her mother's voice teaching her songs. She remembered her father telling her stories by the fire. She remembered running barefoot through tall grass, feeling free. That freedom was gone for now, but it still lived somewhere inside her. Thomas didn't speak much. He focused on the road. But once he glanced at her and said softly, "My ranch is quiet. No one will bother you there." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't grand. But it was the first kind word she had heard in a very long time. She didn't answer, but she looked ahead at the road and breathed a little deeper. The desert stretched wide on both sides. The night was coming, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't surrounded by strangers who saw her as nothing. She was sitting beside a man who didn't look at her with judgment. She didn't know who Thomas really was or why he had bought her. She didn't trust him yet, but something deep in her heart told her that this might be the beginning of something different. Not easy, not perfect, but different. The road was long and the stars began to shine above them. Ayanna wrapped her arms around herself, not from fear, but from quiet thought. She didn't belong to this place, and yet she was here. She didn't choose this path, but she could still choose how to walk it. Thomas gave the horses a gentle nudge, and the wagon rolled on through the night. Behind them, the town grew smaller. Ahead of them, the unknown stretched wide and endless. Ayanna didn't smile, but a small warmth grew in her chest. She had survived many storms before. This was just another journey. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead to a place where she could rebuild her life on her own terms. The road to Thomas's ranch was long, quiet, and filled with open land on every side. Ayanna sat on the wooden seat of the wagon, holding her hands in her lap. She could hear the soft sound of the horses' hooves on the dirt road, and the wind moving gently through the dry grass. She had no idea what waited for her at the end of this journey, but her heart told her that something was different this time. Thomas didn't talk much during the ride. He seemed like a man who was used to silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It felt calm, like the kind that exists when the land is wide and the sky is clear. Once in a while he would glance at her, not with suspicion, not with pity, but as if to make sure she was all right. When they finally reached the ranch, the moon was high above them. The house wasn't big, but it was well built. Ayanna noticed the wooden fence around the open field, a small barn to the right, and a few chickens sleeping in a corner near the house. The air smelled of hay and warm earth. It wasn't fancy, but it felt peaceful. Thomas jumped down from the wagon and gave her a hand to step down. She didn't take it at first. She wasn't used to people offering help kindly. But after a moment, she accepted. Her feet touched the cool ground and she looked around quietly. "You can rest in the small room next to the kitchen," Thomas said softly. "It's not much, but it's warm and safe." Ayanna nodded. She didn't say thank you, but her eyes held a quiet acknowledgement. She followed him inside the house. The walls were simple and made of wood, with a table in the center, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace with warm flames dancing inside. Ayanna felt the warmth on her face after many cold nights under open skies. The small room Thomas showed her had a bed, a folded blanket, and a small window. She sat on the edge of the bed, still alert but slightly more at ease. As Thomas closed the door gently behind him, she lay down and stared at the wooden ceiling. She didn't sleep right away, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't lying in fear. The next morning, sunlight came through the window, and the smell of bread filled the air. When Ayanna stepped out of the room, she saw Thomas at the table with a loaf of bread and a pot of warm tea. He didn't order her to do anything. He simply said, "There's food here. If you want." She sat across from him slowly. She wasn't used to people offering things without expecting something in return. She took a piece of bread, holding it gently in her hands before taking a small bite. It was soft, fresh, and warm. Something inside her softened a little too. Days turned into weeks. Life on the ranch followed a quiet rhythm. Thomas woke up early every morning to care for the animals. Ayanna began to help on her own, not because he told her to, but because she wanted to. She started by feeding the chickens, then helped carry water, and later began tending to the horses. At first, Thomas was surprised to see her working so carefully. She had a way with animals. The horses that were restless around strangers calmed down when she approached them. She whispered softly to them in her own language, and they listened. She didn't speak much to Thomas, but slowly, a silent understanding grew between them. When she worked, he worked beside her. When she cooked, he gathered wood for the fire. Their days were filled with small, wordless exchanges that built trust without needing many sentences. One afternoon, Thomas showed her how to mend a fence. She had never done it before, but she learned quickly. Her hands were strong and steady. She was determined to be useful, not because she owed anyone, but because it gave her a sense of purpose. In the evenings, when the work was done, they sometimes sat outside the house looking at the stars. Thomas would tell small stories about the land, the changing seasons, and the way the sky told him when rain would come. Ayanna listened quietly, her face calm, her mind painting pictures with every word. One night, Thomas asked gently, "Do you miss your home?" Ayanna hesitated. For a long time, no one had asked her about her feelings. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered softly. Thomas didn't ask for more. He simply nodded back as if to say, "I understand." That simple moment became one of the first times she felt seen, not as someone lost, but as someone human. Seasons changed. The air grew warmer, the grass greener. Ayanna became part of the daily life at the ranch. She repaired fences, planted vegetables, and cared for the animals with quiet dedication. She never claimed the place as hers, but her touch was everywhere. Thomas began to notice the small changes she brought. The horses seemed healthier, the plants grew better, and the house felt less empty. It wasn't because she tried to change things. It was because she carried a quiet strength that filled the silence. The townspeople sometimes passed by the ranch and spoke about her in whispers. They had called her worthless once, but now their whispers were softer, uncertain. Some said Thomas had been foolish to bring her home. Others, seeing how the ranch thrived, started to wonder if maybe they had been wrong. But Thomas never cared what they said. And Ayanna didn't either. She didn't live for their opinions. She lived each day with quiet courage, holding on to her sense of self. One evening, as the sun began to sink low and the sky turned golden, Thomas heard the faint sound of horses in the distance. A small group of travelers was passing near the ranch. The land had been unsafe for weeks because of wandering groups, but Thomas stayed calm. Ayanna was the first to notice the faint dust rising on the horizon. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but out of instinct. She had learned to pay attention to the land. She walked to Thomas and quietly pointed to the distant line of riders. Thomas nodded. Together, they calmly brought the horses into the barn and closed the gates. Ayanna made sure the chickens were safe, and Thomas checked the door locks. They didn't panic. They worked side by side like two people who trusted each other. The riders didn't stop. They passed by without trouble, and the dust slowly disappeared into the distance. But that night, as Thomas sat by the fire, he looked at Ayanna with quiet respect. She had seen the signs before he did. She had helped protect the place without a single word. "Thank you," he said simply. Ayanna didn't answer, but a small, almost invisible smile touched her lips. In time, her quiet strength became the heart of the ranch. She wasn't loud. She didn't try to lead, but everything seemed to work better when she was near. Thomas often wondered how a woman once ignored by everyone had become the most dependable person he knew. The years began to fold gently into each other. The house grew warmer, the land richer. People in town noticed the change, but didn't know how to explain it. All they saw was that the ranch was thriving, and Thomas, once a lonely man, now had someone by his side who made the world seem steadier. But for Ayanna, the change was deeper. She had come to this place with nothing but her courage. She hadn't chosen this road, but she had chosen how to walk it. She found her place not by asking for it, but by building it quietly each day. One late evening, as the stars shone above, Thomas and Ayanna stood outside the house together. The wind moved softly through the grass. Thomas looked at the land and said quietly, "This place would not be the same without you." Ayanna looked at the stars, her heart full, but her words few. "This place gave me a chance to breathe again," she replied softly. They didn't need long speeches. The silence between them was warm. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they understand each other without needing to explain. The woman once left alone at an auction was no longer a forgotten name. She had built a new life, one made of steady mornings, starry nights, kind glances, and quiet strength. She was not someone to be owned or pitied. She was a person who shaped her own path with resilience. The ranch became more than a home. It became a story. A quiet story told in the way the horses ran freely, the way the garden grew stronger each year, and the way two souls, once strangers, found trust in each other. And in that quiet story, Ayanna was no longer the last one standing. She was the heart of everything that grew.